Midnight in Mesquite Crossing was never meant to be quiet, but that night the storm drowned every sound, except the rain hammering the tin roof of the Desert Saloon. Wind shoved against the walls with a howl that made the lanterns sway, their light trembling across sawdust floors. The doors burst open with every gust, letting in curtains of water that turned the street into a river of mud. Folks gathered inside, shoulders hunched, hats dripping, boots squelching as they found their way to tables. Even in the chaos, the saloon had its own kind of calm, a piano in the corner, its keys worn smooth, and a woman sitting at it, her hands hovering like she was about to pray. Elena Mora was known for her playing, soft enough to calm a drunk, strong enough to keep a fight from starting. Tonight, her music was silent. Instead, she studied the note pinned to her sheet music, its edges curled and water-stained. It read, "Play the widow's waltz at midnight. Truth will show itself." She'd been in this town 5 years, long enough to know when danger was coming. The saloon smelled of wet leather, smoke, and nerves. Nora Bell, the saloon's owner, stood behind the bar, cleaning glasses no one would touch until morning. Her expression didn't change, even when Sheriff Asa Whitcomb leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, his badge dull under lamplight. He'd been a lawman too long, his eyes always searching, his jaw always tight. Elias Cutter, a stranger who'd arrived that afternoon with a name no one recognized, sat at a shadowed table. He'd claimed he was waiting out the weather, but his coat was too fine for a drifter, and his silence had weight. In another corner sat Jonah Pike, a man whose scarred face spoke louder than his voice. People said he'd seen too much of everything. The clock above the bar struck 12, and thunder cracked so close it rattled the whiskey bottles. Elena's breath trembled, but she pressed her fingers to the ivory keys. The first note rose, soft and low, floating over the storm. The sound cut through every conversation, every shuffle of boots, every whisper of fear. One by one, heads turned toward the piano, as if the song were pulling them forward. She knew this melody from childhood, a tune her mother used to hum while folding linens, one that always made her father go silent. Tonight, it returned like a ghost. The storm outside thrashed harder, but inside, silence thickened. The saloon had become a church, the storm its choir, and Elena's trembling hands, the sermon. Someone near the bar muttered, "That's the song they buried with her." The words sank deep, but Elena kept playing, each note steady as rain. Nora's eyes flickered to the stranger in the corner, whose fingers curled tight around a whiskey glass. Sheriff Whitcomb shifted his weight, one hand resting near his holster. Even Jonah Pike, the man no one dared cross, sat straighter. A gust of wind slammed the door open, and for a heartbeat, the lantern light flickered out. When it flared back, Elena's music carried on, soft, steady, and dangerous, like a story finally ready to be told. A town on the edge. The Desert Saloon had become a lifeboat in the storm, a single glow in a town that felt swallowed by night. Outside, Mesquite Crossing was unrecognizable, its main street transformed into a raging creek, wagons stranded at odd angles, and a lone stagecoach tilted in the muck like a wounded animal. Its passengers, a mix of traveling merchants and weary families, had been forced to take refuge inside. They clung to steaming tin cups and damp blankets, their faces pale under the flickering lamplight. The wind howled through gaps in the boarded windows, rattling them so fiercely it seemed the whole building might lift from its foundations. Inside, the saloon held its breath. No one dared speak too loudly, as though their voices might invite whatever was prowling in the shadows outside. Nora Bell moved behind the bar with a calmness that steadied the room, her hands quick and efficient. She'd run this saloon for over a decade, had seen gunfights break out over poker games and hearts shattered at tables still sticky with spilled whiskey, but something in the air tonight unsettled even her. She polished another glass and cast a wary glance at Sheriff Asa Whitcomb. The sheriff leaned near the door, arms folded, his gaze scanning every face as if each one carried a secret. He'd been a fixture in Mesquite Crossing since before the railroad surveyors arrived with their promises and paperwork, but even he looked uneasy tonight. He'd checked his revolver 3 times, a habit only noticed by those who'd known him long. Near the stove, Mateo Reyes sat tuning his fiddle. A vaquero with calloused hands and a weathered face, he plucked a string and turned a peg, with the same patience he used on stubborn cattle. His presence always brought warmth to the saloon, but tonight his fingers were slow, distracted. He'd been humming the melody Elena played, a frown creasing his brow. "I heard that once," he murmured to himself. "A long time ago." The words were soft, but they carried across the silent room. A woman holding her child closer near the fire shivered, as though recognizing the tune too. Rumors had been eating at Mesquite Crossing for weeks. Railroad men sniffing around deeds, whispers of Silas Gray's growing reach, and tales of old Spanish grants resurfacing like bones in a riverbed. Tonight, those whispers felt close, like they'd been waiting for the storm to mask their approach. The waltz Elena played curled through the room, unearthing memories people had tried to bury. A rancher near the wall drained his cup and muttered, "That's the song they played when Rosa disappeared." His voice cracked on her name. The room shifted, eyes flicking between Elena at the piano and Sheriff Asa, who stiffened but said nothing. The clock ticked loudly in the silence, the waltz filling every gap. Elena's hands trembled slightly, but her gaze never lifted from the keys. It was as if the song itself was alive, dragging secrets out of the shadows. Outside, thunder cracked like a warning shot, and the stagecoach lanterns flickered through the rain. The saloon had become a fortress, and in that fortress, no one could ignore the ghosts summoned by the melody, names that cut like wire. The melody wound through the saloon like smoke, slow and deliberate, curling into every dark corner. Each note seemed to scrape away layers of the night until all that was left was memory, raw and dangerous. Elena's hands moved with precision, though her heartbeat thudded faster than the storm's rhythm outside. She didn't need the sheet music. This song lived in her bones, but she wished she didn't know it so well. The widow's waltz wasn't just a melody, it was a story her family never finished telling. Sheriff Asa shifted near the door, his boot tapping softly against the floorboards, a man betrayed by his own nerves. His eyes swept the room, but his jaw tightened when Elena's soft voice broke through the music. "My mother," she said, her words catching like a burr in her throat, "was Rosa." The name landed like a shot. A hush, deeper than before, fell over the saloon. Asa's shoulders stiffened, and the corner of his mouth twitched, as if the name had pulled a memory from a wound he'd long tried to stitch closed. A glass slipped from someone's hand, shattering on the floor. But no one moved. Jonah Pike sat in his shadowed corner, face half hidden by the brim of his hat, the lamplight grazing the jagged scar that ran from temple to jaw. He stared down into his drink, unmoving, but his knuckles whitened around the glass. He didn't flinch at the sound of the music, but those close enough to see him swore his lips moved along with the tune. Silent as a prayer. Eli Cutter, the quiet stranger with the polished boots and stiff posture, shifted uneasily at his table, as though he'd been caught trespassing somewhere sacred. He turned his head to the window, pretending interest in the sheets of rain blurring the street. But his eyes darted to Elena's face, then away, then back again. From behind the bar, Nora Bell set down a whiskey bottle and bent low to pry open a drawer that had swollen from the damp air. Her sharp nails scraped against the wood as she pulled it free. The hidden compartment inside was something only she and her late bookkeeper knew of, and tonight the storm had loosened its secrets. She slid out a small, water-warped envelope, sealed with a wax stamp half melted away. The telegram inside was brief and cryptic, the ink smudged but legible. Midnight. The waltz unlocks the deed. Nora's breath caught, but she tucked the message into her apron without a word. Elena's song faltered for just a moment before resuming, softer now, almost reverent. The tension in the room coiled, tighter, like barbed wire pulled between fence posts. Someone whispered, she's back, and another voice replied, no, that's her daughter. The lanterns flickered, shadows lurching across the walls like restless spirits. Outside, thunder roared, shaking the glass. Inside, nobody moved, their attention held hostage by Elena's trembling hands and the ghost of Rosa's song, as if a grave had been cracked open and every secret in Mesquite Crossing was clawing its way into the light. The man who returned without a name. Lightning split the sky, flooding the saloon with a flash so bright it carved every face into sharp relief. The stranger in the corner, Eli Cutter, he called himself, looked up, and for the first time that night, his face was clear. He was older than his pressed coat suggested, his jawline gaunt, his eyes carrying the kind of weariness only men who'd outrun themselves wore. Nora Bell's hand froze mid-pour, the whiskey bottle hovering in the air. Her breath hitched so softly it could have been mistaken for a sigh, but her eyes had gone wide enough for those closest to notice. Elias? She whispered. The name hung in the air like gun smoke. All heads turned, confusion flickering among the regulars. Elias Bell, Nora's husband, had been declared dead 6 years ago, swallowed by the Jornada del Muerto desert while chasing a railroad contract that promised to make him rich. His death had hardened Nora, given her a reputation as a woman too strong to be broken twice. But there he was, sitting in her saloon under a false name, a ghost dressed in a fine wool coat. Elias rose slowly, the chair legs dragging across the floorboards in protest. He tipped his hat in a gesture that felt too formal, too strained. Nora, he said, his voice a gravel road. I had my reasons. Reasons, she spat, slamming the bottle down so hard the liquid splashed. The saloon fell utterly silent. Even the storm outside seemed to hold its breath. I owed Silas Gray money. More than I could pay. He wanted land deeds, railroad maps, names of surveyors willing to sell out towns like this one. Elias's eyes flicked toward Sheriff Asa, then back to Nora. I thought if I disappeared, you'd be safe. Sheriff Asa stepped forward, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver, not in threat, but in habit. You staged your death to dodge Silas Gray? He asked, his tone a blend of disbelief and anger. Elias nodded once, shame bending his shoulders. Men like him, they don't just want what's yours, Sheriff. They want to own the dirt under your feet, the air you breathe. He paused, his voice dropping lower. And they don't forget. Nora's fingers tightened around the edge of the bar, her knuckles white. You let me mourn you, she said, her voice shaking, the fury in it muted only by years of exhaustion. I know, Elias whispered, but I've come back because something's moving. Gray's after Mesquite Crossing now, that telegram. He pointed to Nora's apron pocket without being told. He's making his play tonight. The piano fell silent. Elena's hands hovered over the keys, her eyes darting between Elias and Nora. A gust of wind slammed the shutters, rattling them against the glass. Somewhere in the crowd, Jonah Pike shifted in his seat, his scar catching the light. He muttered something under his breath, but it was lost to the storm. The room had transformed in an instant, from a refuge from rain to a powder keg waiting for a spark. Nora stared at Elias, her chest rising and falling with controlled fury, and finally said, Then you'd better start talking fast, Elias Bell, because I'm not sure I want you walking out of here alive. A box of paper and bones. Sheriff Ace's boots thudded against the warped floorboards as he crossed to the door, his jaw locked tight as a trap. He muttered something to one of his deputies, and within minutes, 2 soaked men wrestled a heavy iron safe through the entrance, their shoulders straining as the storm tried to shove its way in with them. The safe landed on the floor with a hollow bang, and every head turned as if the noise itself carried judgment. Nora's hand went instinctively to her apron pocket, where the telegram Elias had pointed out earlier pressed against her. She didn't pull it out. Not yet. Asa knelt by the safe, his fingers working the combination with surprising grace for a man with hands so scarred. The crowd murmured in low tones, their whispers blending with the hiss of rain. The lantern light flickered, throwing long, spindly shadows across the walls. Elias stood off to one side, watching as though he already knew what would be inside. Nora never took her eyes off him, her rage simmering into something quieter, sharper. With a final click, Asa swung the safe door open. Inside was a tin box, dented and water-stained, its latch nearly rusted through. He placed it carefully on a table in the center of the saloon and opened it to reveal a neat stack of papers, old Spanish land grants, their ink faded but still legible, alongside newer territorial deeds stamped with seals from Santa Fe. The room leaned closer, curiosity pulling them in like moths to a flame. Mateo Reyes was the first to step forward, his dark brows knitting as he traced the old family names with a calloused finger. "These grants go back nearly 100 years, he murmured, his voice low but carrying in the hush. "Mora, Reyes, de la Cruz." He paused and glanced at Elena, whose breath caught audibly. "Those are my mother's people," she whispered. The sheriff nodded grimly. These documents prove Mesquite Crossing was built on the Mora Grant Line. The saloon, the mercantile, half the cattle pens, all of it. He exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he'd been carrying for years. "If this is true, Elena, you and your family own this land, not Silas Gray, not the railroad. You." The weight of his words settled over the room like a thick quilt. People exchanged uneasy glances, whispers rippling through the crowd. Nora's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then why haven't you brought this forward before, Sheriff?" Asa hesitated, his gaze fixed on the box. "Because a piece of paper can get folks killed faster than a bullet," he said finally. "And Silas Gray's not a man to take kindly to being told no." Jonah Pike, silent until now, shifted in his chair. His scarred face remained unreadable, but his gravelly voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That box has been worth blood for a long time," he muttered. "Some of it mine. Some of it Rosa's." Elena's head snapped toward him, eyes wide. "You knew my mother?" Jonah didn't answer right away. He reached for his drink, took a slow sip, and stared at the tin box. "I knew enough to be haunted," he said. Outside, the storm wailed like a grieving widow, wind rattling the shutters and making the lanterns dance. Inside, the saloon felt like a courtroom, the papers on the table evidence of something too big to stay buried. Elena's fingers trembled against the edge of the piano. "If these papers could have saved her," she whispered, "then someone chose not to." Sheriff Asa closed his eyes for a moment, the lines in his weathered face deepening. He looked at Elena then, his voice heavy. "I'm afraid that someone was me." A night of debt and ghosts. The sheriff's confession hung in the air like smoke from a gun just fired. A ripple of disbelief moved through the saloon, whispers darting like startled birds. Elena's fingers froze on the piano keys, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. Asa didn't flinch under her stare. He'd been holding this truth so long it had carved lines into his face, and now that it was out, he stood as if bracing for the storm inside to match the one outside. "I stalled the eviction order," Asa said, his voice low and steady. "Thought I could buy Rosa time. I hid these papers in that safe and told myself I'd set it right. But I was too slow. When the gray men came..." He trailed off, his hand curling into a fist. "She was gone before I could fix it." Elena's mouth trembled, but her voice was sharp. "You let her die believing she'd lost everything." Asa lowered his gaze, his badge catching the lamplight as if mocking him. "I thought I was protecting the town. Instead, I buried a woman's name with her." The rain roared louder, drowning out the quiet gasp of a door swinging open. A man stumbled in, soaked to the bone, his hat missing, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "Horse outside," he croaked. "No rider." He collapsed onto a chair, coughing so hard his shoulders shook. Nora was quick to bring him a blanket, her face pale but calm. Mateo darted outside, braving the downpour, and returned leading a riderless chestnut horse. The animal's flanks were lathered, its eyes rolling in fear. Tied beneath the saddle was a parcel wrapped in oilskin, the twine pulled tight as if its sender had known the journey would be rough. The sheriff took it carefully, laying it on the bar like something sacred. The crowd pressed in as he sliced the twine with his pocket knife. Inside were keepsakes, a woman's silver locket, a folded sheet of handwritten music, and a baby's ribbon, brown with age and something darker. Elena touched the ribbon with trembling hands, the world spinning around her. This was hers," she whispered, her voice cracking. Jonah Pike, still in his corner, closed his eyes, the weight of memory pulling his shoulders low. "I seen that ribbon before," he muttered. 10 years ago, the night we cleared the Mora place. I was there. Rosa fought harder than any man I've ever known. She didn't lose that house. We took it from her." Gasps rose from the crowd, but Jonah's voice was steady, almost hollow. "I told myself I was doing a job." "But that song you're playing," his voice cracked for the first time. "I've heard it every night since." The room went still, the storm outside a restless drumbeat. Nora placed her hand on the sheriff's shoulder, but he didn't move. Elena clutched the ribbon like a lifeline. "She's still here," she whispered, "in this room." The words sent a shiver through the crowd, because for the first time, everyone believed her. Blood knows its harmony. The parcel's contents lay scattered on the bar like evidence at a trial. The silver locket, the faded sheet music with its delicate handwriting, and that ribbon, a scrap of fabric holding more weight than any gun in the room. Elena's fingers trembled as she traced the tiny embroidered initials stitched into its edge. "R.M.," she whispered, "Rosa Mora." She looked up, her eyes wild, and for the first time, the saloon patron saw something unshakable in her face. Recognition. Mateo Reyes stepped closer, his dark brows drawn tight. "That's not just any ribbon," he said softly. It looks like the one my mother kept in her trunk. She said it belonged to her first baby, a twin she lost during the chaos of a fire." He reached into his satchel, his hands steady despite the storm's rage outside. From it, he pulled a nearly identical ribbon, its thread slightly brighter but sewn by the same hand. He laid it beside Elena's, and the room inhaled sharply as the two pieces of history sat side by side like mirror images. Elena's breath caught. She looked at Mateo, studying the curve of his jaw, the shape of his eyes. In that moment, she didn't see a fiddler or a friend. She saw herself reflected back. "You," she whispered, "we—" Mateo nodded slowly, the truth dawning like a sunrise neither of them had expected. "We're brother and sister," he said quietly, the words tasting both sweet and bitter. A hush deeper than before settled over the saloon. The storm's howl seemed distant now, muffled by the enormity of the revelation. Nora leaned forward, her hand covering her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. Even Sheriff Asa, hardened by decades of grit and regret, bowed his head as though in prayer. Elena clutched the ribbon close to her chest. "She must have tried to save us both," she said, her voice breaking. "In the fire, in the chaos. She got us out, but someone split us up," Mateo finished, his voice sharp with sudden anger. His gaze shifted to Jonah Pike, who hadn't moved from his seat. Jonah's scar glistened in the lamplight as he stared down at his drink, shoulders heavy with guilt. "I carried you to 2 different arms," Jonah rasped, finally lifting his gaze. One to a traveling midwife heading west, the other to a rancher's wife who swore she'd raise the boy as her own. Gray's men were circling like vultures, I thought I was saving you from them, but maybe I was saving myself." His voice cracked, a sound so raw it startled even the hardest cowhands in the room. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steel. "You stole our family," she said. Jonah nodded once. "I did." The piano sat silent, the storm's drumbeat filling the space where music had been. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Matteo reached for his fiddle, tightening his bow with trembling hands. "Play," he whispered to Elena. "For her." She placed her fingers on the keys and began again, the waltz now carrying the weight of blood and truth. Each note trembled with grief, but beneath it was something stronger, connection, a melody of family piecing itself back together. The room leaned in, their faces softening, tears glinting in lantern light. The storm pounded the saloon walls, but no one heard it. All they heard was Rosa's song, alive again, wrapping around two siblings who'd found each other in the unlikeliest of nights, and the heavy, unspoken question that followed. Who else's hands had shaped this tragedy? Truth dances with a gun. The saloon had become a cathedral of truth. The storm's roar outside softened to a low growl. As Elena's music filled every shadow, couples rose hesitantly from their chairs, stepping onto the floor as if guided by something older than memory. Boots scuffed the wood in time with the piano, skirts swayed in lantern light, and Matteo's fiddle joined in, its voice raw with sorrow and longing. The dance was not for celebration, it was for reckoning. Sheriff Asa stood near the door, his hand resting loosely on the worn grip of his revolver. He'd seen shootouts, cattle wars, and hangings, but this night carried a different weight. The waltz felt like confession, each note peeling back another layer of mesquite-crossing sins. Jonah Pike sat hunched over his drink, his shoulders trembling, as though the music itself was judging him. As the song wound its way through the room, Jonah's voice finally broke free. "I lied," he rasped, the words barely audible over the music. The dancer slowed, turning toward him. His hand shook as he set his glass down. "Rosa didn't die in that fire. She fell because of me." The air thickened. Elena froze mid-note, the piano humming softly under her fingertips. Jonah's scar caught the lamplight as he lifted his head. "We came to clear her land. She wouldn't let go of the deed papers, and I shoved her, harder than I meant to. She hit the stone hearth." His voice cracked, raw and hoarse. "I told Silas Gray it was an accident. He paid me to keep quiet, to bury it. And I did." For 10 years, gasps rippled through the saloon like wind over dry grass. Sheriff Asa's jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the table's edge. "You let this town think she died in that fire," Asa said, his voice shaking with fury. "You let her children grow up as orphans while Gray carved this place into pieces." Jonah's eyes glistened with something close to tears. "I've been carrying her ghost ever since," he whispered, "but I can't carry it no more." Elena's breath trembled as she slid her fingers across the keys again. Slow, deliberate, the waltz resumed, mournful and haunting, filling the silence Jonah's confession left behind. But before the weight of it could settle, a shot cracked from outside, splintering a window pane and silencing the room. Sheriff Asa spun toward the door, revolver drawn, his boots pounding across the floor. The storm outside had quieted just enough for everyone to hear the creak of saddles and the muffled snort of horses. Nora's voice cut through the tension, sharp as a whip. "Gray's men!" she hissed. The saloon erupted in movement. Men ducked for cover. Women grabbed children and crouched behind tables. Elias Bell strode forward, his face pale but determined. "He knows the deed's here," Elias said. "He won't leave without it." Elena's hands hovered above the keys, her heart pounding in her chest. Jonah pushed himself up from his seat, grim-faced. "Then let's give him a welcome he won't forget." The lantern light flickered violently as a second shot rang out, closer this time. The saloon was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a battlefield. The last dance at the Desert Saloon. The Desert Saloon was no longer a haven from the storm, but a fortress under siege. Sheriff Asa barked orders with a voice that cut through the chaos, his revolver steady in one hand while his other gestured toward the tables. "Upend 'em, boys. Make cover." Men scrambled, overturning heavy oak tables and dragging barrels to block the doors. Lanterns cast flickering shadows that danced along the walls, transforming the saloon into a flickering battleground. The sound of horses outside and the distant bark of orders told everyone what they already feared. Silas Gray's men had come prepared. Elias Bell stepped forward, his face pale but determined, clutching a leather satchel filled with documents that could topple Gray's empire. "They'll tear this town apart for these," he said, placing the satchel on the bar. Nora's eyes flashed like steel. "Then they won't get 'em." She reached beneath the counter, pulling out a shotgun that gleamed in the lantern light. "I'm done losing to that man." Elena crouched near the piano, her heart pounding, clutching the locket from the parcel against her chest. Mateo knelt beside her, his fiddle still slung over his shoulder like a talisman. "Stay behind me," he said quietly, though his own hands trembled. "You think I'm letting you take a bullet before I do?" Elena shot back, her voice steady despite her fear. The saloon's rear window shattered, spraying glass across the floor as a bullet thudded into the far wall. Asa fired back without hesitation, the crack of his revolver ringing through the storm's lull. "They're trying the alley," he shouted. "Jonah, cover that side." Jonah Pike, the scarred man who'd just confessed to Rosa's death, moved without hesitation, grabbing a rifle and taking position by the back door. His face was pale, his jaw tight. Whatever he'd done, tonight was his chance to pay for it. The gunfire outside paused and a voice boomed over the rain. "Hand over the papers and no one else gets hurt." It was Silas Gray himself, his tone smooth as oil. Nora slammed another round into her shotgun. "Coward won't even step inside," she muttered. "Gray knows we've got him," Elias said grimly. "If these get to the judge, his land theft's done for. He's here because this is his last chance." Sheriff Asa motioned to Mateo. "Take the East Trail at dawn. Ride like the devil's on your heels. Get these to Santa Fe. I'll get through," Mateo promised, gripping his rifle, "even if I have to swim the Rio Grande." Another gunshot cracked, grazing the doorframe. Nora fired back, her shot echoing like thunder. Outside, Gray's men cursed and pulled back. A lantern was tossed into the mud, its sudden flare lighting the street in a harsh orange glow. The silhouettes of armed riders danced across the windows, but they didn't advance. The storm had eased, and with dawn creeping over the mountains, the attackers faltered. By the time sunlight pierced the saloon's windows, the riders were gone, retreating into the scrub. The Desert Saloon stood battered but unbroken. Elias picked up the satchel of deeds, his jaw tight. Nora lowered her shotgun, smoke curling from its barrel. "Dawn bought us time," Asa said, holstering his revolver. "But it's not over." Elias nodded, his face grave. "No, but Mesquite Crossing has a fighting chance now." Elena stood slowly, her hand still clutching the locket. "She'd be proud," she whispered. And somehow, everyone knew who she meant. Morning after, tracks ahead. By mid-morning, the storm had rolled off toward the mesas, leaving Mesquite Crossing draped in a strange calm. The muddy street glistened under the pale sun, wagon ruts filled with standing water that reflected the battered town like a mirror. The Desert Saloon smelled of gunpowder, wet wood, and coffee brewing somewhere in the back. Its doors were still bolted, though the threat had passed, and inside people moved softly like mourners leaving a wake. The night's violence clung to them like damp clothes, heavy and uncomfortable. Sheriff Asa Whitcomb stood by the bar, his badge in his hand, staring at it as if it were a ghost. "This belongs to someone better," he said finally, placing it gently on the counter. Nora Bell watched him from behind the bar, her sharp eyes softer now. "You're the only law this town trusts," she said, but Asa shook his head. They trusted a man who buried truth. "I'll earn it back one day, maybe, but not today." He turned and walked toward the door, his shoulders stooped but lighter somehow, as if the confession he'd carried for a decade had finally let him breathe. Elias Bell leaned against the piano, the satchel of deeds on the table beside him. He looked years older than when he'd first stepped through the saloon doors under his false name. "These papers will burn Silas Gray to the ground," he said, his voice steady but weary. "I'll swear it all under oath." "No more running." His gaze flicked to Nora, whose arms were crossed tightly, though her eyes betrayed something softer. "And you'll stay?" she asked. Elias nodded, not as a promise, but as a man finally willing to face what he'd left behind. Elena sat at the piano, the silver locket around her neck, her fingers idly pressing soft, mournful chords. Mateo stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "We'll keep the land in the family," he said. "This saloon, too, if Nora will have us as partners." Nora's expression softened, and she gave a slow nod. "Rosa built this town's heart," she said quietly. "It's only right her children carry it forward." Jonah Pike lingered near the back, his hat in his hands, head bowed low. He'd stayed through the night's firefight, protecting the very people he'd wronged. But his shame was a living thing. "I'll testify," he muttered. "Tell 'em what I did to Rosa. Maybe they'll hang me for it, but I'll stand before her name gets buried again." Elena turned on the piano bench and studied him, her eyes glistening. "She'd want truth, not vengeance," she said softly. Jonah's lips trembled and he nodded, tears streaking the grime on his cheeks. Outside, the first train whistle in weeks echoed faintly through the crisp morning air, a promise that justice might arrive with steel and steam. Elena began to play the Widows' waltz again, slower now, filled with sorrow but also hope. The notes drifted out through open windows onto the washed streets, where townsfolk gathered to see if Mesquite Crossing had survived. Some stood with their hats off, listening. Some wept quietly. The music felt like a prayer, a benediction for a night that had unearthed every secret buried in that desert town. Nora stepped outside, shotgun still in hand, and looked east where the railroad tracks cut through the horizon. "Storm's over," she said, "but something's coming." Elena's fingers danced across the keys, the final note lingering in the air like the scent of rain. "Some songs," she whispered, "return what was stolen." And with that, the Desert Saloon's doors swung open to the sunlight, ready for whatever the tracks would bring next.